Back. Last lecture was on cultural relativism, which is one way of arguing that morality is not objective. There are no objective moral truths. Uh, this lecture will be looking at another ethical theory that makes the same claim, right? That there is no objective moral truth. If there is any sort of bias to this course, it probably is towards um, the claim that there are objective moral truths, right? Now, if you want to write an interesting paper, right, to argue for some form of subjectivism or relativism, that's great. Do it. But what we're going to do here is consider some ethical theories we call subjectivism, and then largely spend some time beating up on them, right? But they are significant theories, right? And you're certainly welcome to believe them and argue for them if you like, right? We see the sort of initial premise for this form of sort of anti-objectivism about morality uh, starts with a similar premise, right? Noting that moral judgments differ on certain issues, right? This time, not necessarily across cultures, but just across different people, even within the same culture. So, to take an example, homosexuality, right? So, is it moral or immoral? That is still a matter of contention in this country, right? Um, Attitudes have changed. There was a time, um, not so long ago. I mean, I think there are even currently in some states and areas laws on the books making homosexuality illegal. Um, they're less actively enforced, but they were. I'm uh, like currently reading a biography of Andy Warhol, and he was active in the late 40s, early 50s when and he was gay, and if you were at a gay bar, you definitely had the risk of being busted by cops and imprisoned for actually, in some cases, like a substantial amount of time, right? Just for appearing to be gay. Um, so things are different now in general, right? We can sort of see the changes in attitudes just by looking at some polls. 2001, there's a poll, about 40% of Americans considered gay relations to be morally acceptable, 53% considered them wrong. So a majority considered it to be wrong, right, as recently as 2001. And then in 2017, a similar poll sees a shift where now a majority, 63%, see homosexuality as morally acceptable, only 33% as wrong. Still a substantial amount of people, though, right? In a country as 300 million people in the U.S., 33% of that is a lot. 100 million about. So judgments still vary, and you see that reflected in political rhetoric and so on. So a couple examples from the text, right? There's a 2001 Pride Parade in New York City, and you see all the local politicians, Democrat and Republican, showing up, giving speeches, implicitly giving support, right, for the cause, and sort of implicitly um, saying homosexuality is not immoral, right? But then, as late as 2017, you got Mike Pence, right, who was vice president at the time, a speech to Congress, right, where he says things like traditional, which is sort of code for heterosexual marriage, is the quote backbone of society, and that without it, quote, society will collapse. Right? So if you think that doing things that will make society collapse are potentially immoral, then again, implicitly, he is saying that homosexuality is immoral. Okay, so again, we have this empirical premise. Yes, different people, right, have different attitudes towards homosexuality, towards the moral status of homosexuality. So, what conclusion can we draw from that sort of difference of opinion, right? Um, well, we've already seen arguments from difference on the chapter of cultural relativism, and we've critiqued those, right? Um, we've seen them from culture to culture, and here we're seeing these differences even from person to person within the same culture. Some people who find homosexuality to be just sort of on the spectrum of normal expressions of sexuality, like there's just variety there, and others find it to be deeply immoral. So, similarly to cultural relativism, right, someone who's arguing for subjectivism may take these differences, right, in attitudes um, as a premise, and draw from that the conclusion that, well, there just is no fact of the matter about whether things are morally right or wrong, right? You could repeat it, not just with homosexuality, but with a number of moral issues, right? Um, any moral issue where there's difference of opinion, right? And you might conclude, well, there's no fact of the matter, right? It's just sort of whatever you think about it. There's only opinions. So we've already critiqued that sort of argument, right? When it came to cultural relativism, we noted that there can be another explanation of the differences in people's opinions. It could be that some of them are right and some of them are wrong, right? That is consistent with there being, right, moral objectivity out there. But let's look at a little bit more sort of sophisticated account of subjectivism that comes to us uh, most prominently from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher from the 1700s, and he was a defender of subjectivism. So his argument was that morality is not actually a sort of rational enterprise, and instead it's what he calls a matter of, quote, sentiment, right, or the emotions. So what he means by that is that um, he's not denying that there is a fact out there in the world, right? Some people are gay, some people are straight. But what he's denying is that there is any fact out there in the world about whether that is right or wrong. Um, there are only feelings people have about that thing, right? And feelings aren't necessarily right or wrong, right? So he says when we're making a moral judgment about something, be it someone's sexuality or whether it's moral or immoral to help the poor, whether it's moral or immoral to murder, um, when we say something like murder is wrong, um, we're not, even though on the surface, the grammar, it sounds like we're stating some sort of fact, right? What we're actually doing is just expressing a feeling that we're having about those things. What we're really saying is, thinking about murder makes me feel bad, right? Thinking about helping the poor makes me feel good. Um, Now, that is a fact of a sort, right? It's a fact about how you feel, right? But what it isn't is a judgment about some fact in the world, some objective rightness or wrongness that obtains in the world, right, for the various things. So let's, for the moment, uh, take Hume's right account and run with it. So if that's the case, then when I say murder is wrong, right, and according to Hume, um, there's no such thing as the wrongness of murder out there in the world, right? It's not an objective claim. Does that mean that what I'm saying is false, right? Um, Maybe, right? It depends on how we interpret my sentence, right? Um, if my sentence is meant to be about some fact and there are no such facts, right, then it would potentially be false. Um, but we also might just reinterpret what I'm saying, right, and say that when I say something like murder is wrong, what I'm really doing is just expressing my approval or disapproval, right? So when I say homosexuality is wrong, I mean, I wouldn't say that, I guess. When someone says homosexuality is wrong, um, again, they're not talking about the world, some objective wrongness in the world. They're in effect saying something like homosexuality, boo, right? Or I disapprove of that, right? Um, the same sort of then applies to all moral judgments, right? So if someone claims it is good to help people, um, that's simply a way of saying I approve of helping people, right? Murder is wrong is just a way of saying I disapprove of murder, right? But again, the claim is the right way to interpret those sorts of sentences is as being about actually your own feelings, your own attitudes towards something, not about some objective fact in the world, right? So let's call this approach, this kind of subjectivism, simple subjectivism. And what simple subjectivism is the claim that moral judgments simply express the speaker's approval or disapproval. So far, it seems like a consistent claim, right? It's not so outrageous to interpret people's expressions that way. And it would help make sense of sort of the rampant moral disagreement out there, right? Um, there's probably less agreement about other sorts of facts out there in the world, right? There's not wild disagreement about whether or not rhinoceroses have horns, right? Um, so why do we have so much trouble agreeing on whether homosexuality is right or wrong if it were a fact in the world? Well, one way you could explain that is that it isn't a fact in the world. Um, the rightness and the wrongness is just an expression of people's feelings. So Hume's account, if nothing else, makes sense of why there is so much disagreement in the world issues, right? But there are also some problems with it. Um, Simple subjectivism seems to entail that there is never any genuine moral disagreement, right? How so? So suppose one person says homosexuality is wrong. Well, according to simple subjectivism, what they're really saying is, I don't approve of that, right? And then when somebody else says, no, it's perfectly morally fine to be homosexuality, according to simple subjectivism, what they're really saying is, I approve of homosexuality, right? Um, so it turns out, right, when we apply the sort of translation scheme of simple subjectivism to our language, what initially on the surface sounded like contradictory claims, right? X is right, X is wrong, turn out to be totally consistent claims. I like X, I don't like X, right? Um, that's not a contradiction. Two different people can like or not like something, right? It's not the same as saying the world is round, the world is flat, right? Um, so what that means is there are never moral disagreements, according to simple subjectivism. People are just expressing their feelings about it. But when they disagree, when they appear to disagree on some moral topic, they in fact do not, which you might think is absurd. If that's what simple subjectivism entails, right? You might think, well, um, that goes a little far. Of course, there must be disagreements on moral issues, right? Um, Now, another way, another form of subjectivism, right, is to say that moral claims are not even statements of fact at all. So when I say I approve of morality, right, um, that's a that does express some fact. It expresses a fact sort of about my psychology, right? But it still is a sort of thing that can be true or false, right? Um, but we could take another interpretation, right? So you might say that when I say that murder is wrong, certainly I'm not expressing some truth about the world, right? It's not the same sort of statement as grass is green or the acceleration of gravity is 9.18 meters per second squared. It also may not be some sort of truth about my psychology, right? Um, Again, to say Mike Pence disapproves of homosexuality is still a statement of fact. It's still a fact about Pence's mind, right? And it could be true or false. Um, but there are all sorts of other things we do with language, right? And some of those things are not expressions of facts. For example, right, I might say, close the door. Um, that's not expressing a fact, right? It's not saying anything about, right, the world. What it is trying to get you to change the world, right? So I'm sort of performing with language there. I'm trying to change the world, right? We do other things with language that are not expressions of ouch, right? Is not again not a statement about the way the world is. It's just an expression of a feeling, right, of pain that's going on. Um, so neither of those statements, strictly speaking, would be true or false, right? It's just not the sort of statement that can be true or false. Questions are another kind of statement that aren't true or false, right? How old are you? It's not true or false. That's just another thing we do with language, right? So emotivism is the claim that moral statements are just in this, they're these other kinds of statements. They're not the true or false type of statements. They're not statements of fact, right? Um, Instead, they're either sort of expressions of your feelings or perhaps attempts to influence other people's behavior. So, according to emotivism, if someone says homosexuality is wrong, the proper translation of that, right? What they're really trying to express is something like homosexuality, yuck, right? Or don't be gay, or something like that, right? They're either sort of just expressing a feeling, or they're maybe trying to induce you to behave in a certain way, but they're not even trying to describe the world. Okay, well, we said the problem with simple subjectivism is it didn't seem to allow for moral disagreement, right? People were just expressing their approval or disapproval. Those are kinds of facts, but they're not facts that conflict with each other in any way. Different people can have different, right, attitudes towards things. So what about emotivism? Um, can there be disagreement there, right? Because that would help. Um, in general, maybe we would favor a theory that allowed for what seems like the obvious fact that people do disagree, right, on moral issues. Um, and there is a sort of sense in which you could say that moral statements disagree on the emotivist account, right? It's not going to be the same sort of straightforward disagreement that you get with just sort of contradictory beliefs, like when one person believes the Earth is round, the other believes the Earth is flat. Um, but they can be sort of contradictory desires, right? So if I want the Mets to win, right, and you want the Mets to lose, um, there is a sense in which we're opposed to each other, right? Even if we're not disagreeing about any particular fact. Um, so you might want to call this sort of disagreement or this sort of opposition a disagreement in attitude, right, as opposed to disagreement in belief. So according to emotivism, then, moral disagreement does exist, but what it is disagreement in attitude rather than disagreement in belief. Okay, well, that's good. That seems to be an advantage for emotivism, right? If it can account for moral disagreement in some sense, even if it's not the original, most obvious sense of disagreement. Um, but in order to do that, right, they've had to sort of reinterpret our language, right? Um, and you might want to ask, is that really an accurate account of what we actually do mean when we make these moral statements, right? So again, what comes out of my mouth is murder is wrong, right? The emotivist wants to say, what you really mean when you say murder is wrong is something like, don't murder people, right? Murder, yuck, something like that. Um, well, one way to find out what I mean when I use a statement is just to ask me, right? And if you ask me what I mean when I say murder is wrong, I would probably say that I'm actually saying something true, right? I'm not just trying to control your behavior or express a feeling. Um, I might also be doing those things, right? But it seems fairly obvious that you ask any human who, if you think that I have any access to what I mean by my words, it's pretty clear that I'm actually trying to express a fact, right? So it's not a problem with emotivism here, even though it seems like it can account for moral disagreement in a sense, is that it's not at all obvious that it's an accurate interpretation, right, of what people mean by these statements. They've got to monkey around and tell you, well, you don't really mean what you think you mean, and that you might find that implausible. So all of this again, sort of monkeying around interpreting language, um, requires a sort of what we call an error theory, right? They have to deny that you actually have any special access to what you mean when you make moral statements, right? They have to say, even when you say murder is wrong, you think you're making a statement of fact, but in fact you are not. You are in error, right? Um, hey, I'm in error about things. I'm not perfect, right? Um, I can believe that I have money in the bank one day and right and cash it, right, write a check and turn out that I'm wrong and I'm overdrawn, right? I make mistakes all the time, right? Um, but error theory, right, about my moral statements is a bit more extreme than just saying, hey, Nate makes mistakes sometimes. What it's saying is you use words and you don't even really know what you mean, right? You utter sentences and you think you mean one thing, but you mean something else. That's a bit stronger claim, right, about just how mistaken Nate is on an everyday basis about things, and you may find it implausible, right? Okay, so this was sort of one thread, right, of subjectivism that we followed down, right, which is when the subjectivist says uh, there are no moral facts, right, then they kind of have to reinterpret all of our moral language to sort of be consistent with that, right? And so that was one sort of little thread that we just followed. Um, but the other thread is just this claim that there are no moral facts, right? Um, this is sort of a bit of an extreme claim in itself. So it's a form of what we call nihilism, right? So nihilism is sort of belief in nothing. Um, it's saying that there are no values, right? So values, again, are sort of things like morality, right? Right and wrong. They're saying there is no right or wrong in the world that exists in nature, right? Nothing is actually right or wrong, right? Again, and then it depends on what sort of subjectivism you are pursuing. And you'll say what right and wrong actually are. They're approval or disapproval. They're just your feelings, right? And so on. But any subjectivist is going to be sort of a nihilist about value. It's not a thing in the world that I can make a factual statement about that would be true or false. Um, what made that view attractive is sort of this, again, this sort of what this, the world is rife with moral disagreement, right? Again, there's not a lot of disagreement about whether rhinoceroses have horns, but there's so much disagreement about homosexuality, right? About um, various moral issues, right? So that's what made it attractive, right? It could explain all that disagreement. Well, because there's nothing actually in the world that can sort of ground our judgment. Um, but not there is not there isn't actually wide moral disagreement on a lot of other things, right? So um, most basically everyone is in agreement that Nazis are bad, right? Except for a few of these Nazis that still seem to hang out there. Um, people are generally in agreement that murder is wrong, right? That you shouldn't steal. Um, so it's not obvious actually how much disagreement there is out there, right? Is there more moral disagreement than there is moral agreement, right? Because if the disagreement suggests to us that there isn't and aren't any moral facts, well, there's also a ton of agreement. So should all this agreement suggest to us that there are moral facts? And you might wonder whether, so if they're right, right, and there are no values, they're nihilists, and you might ask, are is anyone really a nihilist about value when it comes down to it? So here we have, I don't know if anyone's seen The Big Lebowski, right? We're nihilists. We believe in nothing. Nothing, Lebowski. Um, but anyways, like, are you a nihilist about value? Even if you claim to be, right? And then I decided that I wanted to kill you, you might think, hey, Nate, that would be wrong. Don't do it. When it comes down to brass tacks, right, and the stakes are high, you might find that supposed nihilists, right, will show their true colors and they will say, hey, well, hey, there is some right and wrong in the world, right? Put away that knife. Um, And as we saw, that's the most obvious sort of interpretation of the surface grammar of our moral statements. They appear on the face of them to be making factual judgments about the world, right? Um, so both in our actions and in our speech, we all seem to reveal a belief in moral values. Um, now, just because we believe in them doesn't mean they're actually there, right? Um, and it can, in general, just be hard to refute a stubborn nihilist, right? Sort of right scientific experiment could you do, right, that would show that in fact, right, moral facts are out there and are objective? Um, it's not easily um, investigated in that way, and so if someone insists on being a nihilist, it's going to be hard to refute them on it. And indeed, the difficulty, right, in demonstrating scientifically or empirically that there are moral facts um, is part of what leads people to become subjectivists, right? Because they do seem to see this sort of stark divide between um, the sorts of thing that science studies, right, that has made incredible progress, right, and is very good. Like science is very good at investigating what is, right? Um, and so, what science is very good at studying typically is sort of physical objects, right? Um, other things we study psychology, right? We think that's probably ultimately grounded in the brain, but uh, the way we study it is, we study behavior. Those are physical thing, um, and obviously, many of the forces of fundamental physics are not physical objects per se, right? Um, but at any rate, um, if moral values, right, are not sort of within the realm of the things we can study in science, then that suggests that there's something else, objective, right? If science is the study of the objective world, and if morality doesn't fall within that, then maybe it's subjective. Um, maybe, but in reality, science is not the only thing, right? The only method of study, not even the only method of objective study, right? So mathematics, for example, um, tells us objective truths about mathematical objects, right? Um, a physicist is never going to discover, right, the number three, right? It's an abstract object. But even though it's an abstract object, that doesn't mean that we can't study its properties, right? And discover objective truths about mathematics. So logic as well is another example, right? Logic studies the objective properties of systems of reasoning. Um, and in fact, if, as we've been arguing, morality is closely related to reason, right? It's a form of reasoning, um, and it's sort of amenable to the same methods of study or similar methods of study as logic, then maybe it could be objective, right? So, point being, if you think science is the study of the objective and science is the only right good method of study, then you might worry that morality can't be objective. But once you realize that there are other forms of objective inquiry, um, it opens the possibility that the study of morality is one of those, right, methods of inquiry, and that thus morality could still be objective. As we've seen, right, moral judgments can be backed by reasons, right? So here's an example of a moral judgment. Jones is a bad man, right? That's our judgment. And if somebody asks you, well, why do you say that, right? Why do you think Jones is a bad man? You could give reasons, right? You could say, oh, he's a habitual liar. He cheats at cards. He once killed a man over 27 cents, right? And so on. You can give any number of reasons. Um, Obviously, Jones is a made up person, right? But like, if you know any bad people, you could probably give reasons why you think they're bad. Um, so we have a moral judgment. We have reasons for it, right? You could go on and ask further questions, right? So you say, why is Jones a bad man? Oh, he's a liar. Well, what's so bad about being a liar, right? And I could give you some reasons why lying is bad, right? You could keep asking why, right? And the conversation would need to stop somewhere, right? So on the issue of lying, I don't know, it might stop somewhere around human society is just impossible, right? Without a prohibition on lying, right? Um, or something like that, right? So explanation always bottoms out somewhere. But at any rate, in principle, your moral judgments can be backed logically by reasons, right? Um, and of course, reasoning has to end somewhere, but morality is not special in that respect, right? So mathematics, um, I can give you the piano axioms, right? I can say zero is a number, every number has a successor. And you could ask me why. Why is zero a number? Um, there's not an answer for that in mathematics, right? That's a sort of basic axiom that we assume. Um, so any study, even objective, right, realms, uh, do have to bottom out somewhere, right? But it doesn't seem like in principle moral reasoning is any different than mathematical reasoning. Um, and so there's no reason why morality couldn't be objective. So back to the issue of homosexuality, right? Um, Even though there is rampant disagreement on the issue, um, could it be objective, right? Can we reason about it? Well, people have offered reasons for why homosexuality is wrong. A popular one in conservative circles is that it can be, right, allowing for homosexuality could be harmful for children. Um, that appears to be a false claim, right? So good reasons will be true reasons, and if the reason is false, right, then it's not a good reason. Um, but he did try to offer a reason, right? Other arguments will be something like, oh, well, it's wrong. Homosexuality is wrong because it's unnatural. And of course, that will depend on what we mean by unnatural. And then typically, if you try to cash out unnatural in certain ways, that sort of argumentation sort of dissolves you. Like, for example, um, one interpretation of natural is just sort of like statistical, right? Where it says, well, you're in the sort of like the chubby part of the normal distribution, um, right? This little red bit above me. Okay, well, if anything outside, right, anything on the tails of the normal distribution is unnatural in that it's just sort of statistically rare, um, then lots of things are going to turn out to be unnatural, right? It'll Being tall will be unnatural, being left-handed will be unnatural, right, and so on. So it's hard to say why those sorts of things are wrong simply because they're statistically rare, right? But so even if those reasons are bad, point being, this is just an example of how we can do logical reasoning, right, on moral issues. Um, right, going on, another sort of interpretation of what we mean by natural is that, well, it's not sort of doing its job, right? It's not fulfilling its natural function, right? So, for example, um, if your heart doesn't pump blood, then it's a bad heart in a sense, right? It's abnormal, diseased. Um, it has a certain function, and if it fails to perform that function, then there's a value judgment to be made about it, right? And a negative one. So if you try to apply this to sexuality, you might say, well, the natural function of sex is to produce children, and so if homosexual sex does not produce children, then it's unnatural. Um, Problem with that is that there's lots of heterosexual sex that also does not produce children, right? So all of that then would have to be morally wrong as well, right? And contraception would have to be wrong. Um, just if you were naturally infertile, it would be morally wrong for you to have sex, right? I mean, if you're already pregnant, it would be morally wrong for you to have sex, and so on. So um, some religious groups that do bite those bullets, as we say, right, and say, yeah, okay, contraception is wrong too, right? But um, I don't know anyone who says, oh, well, if you were born infertile, then it's immoral for you, right? So it doesn't seem like that's consistent or an interpretation of natural that will get you very far, right? And anyway, sort of like the general premise is not clearly true either, right? So um, this argument seems to depend on a claim that using your body parts for anything other than their natural function is wrong or absurd, right? Okay, so sorry, is wrong. That claim is absurd. So, for example, right? So, what's the function of my hands? Okay, we'll say grasping, right? Okay, if grasping is the function of my hand, then using it to wave is morally wrong, right? And I don't know, you might define the function of your hand several ways, grasping or waving. But okay, I can do something with my hand that no one's ever done that has forms no function, right? Here, I did this, is that morally wrong, right? It's not the job of my hand to do that, right? And probably I don't know if anyone's ever done that exact thing, right? You get the point, right? So it doesn't seem like natural function is going to be very useful as sort of some sort of grounds for morality, right? All right, moving on again, examples of how we can reason about homosexuality, which is all sort of, again, meant to push us towards the idea that there is a form of objectivity, right, to which moral reasoning can conform. If you reason about it logically, then maybe it's objective. Okay, so one reason that people have given against homosexuality is that it is forbidden by the Bible, right? Um, that reason is convincing for people who think that uh, the Bible is a guide to morality, right? Um, and some people just stop there. They say, yeah, if you question the Bible, that's heresy, right? I'm not going to consider any reasons uh, that would question whether the Bible is correct. Um, but in this course, right, we got to question everything, right? We're always going to ask for good reasons, and we don't just stop with what the Bible says. Um, so, is there reason to think that the Bible is a good guide to morality? Um, that is potentially suspect, right? If you sort of read through the other moral claims made in the Bible. So there are a number of moral claims made in the Bible. One is that you should not eat sheep's fat, right? Another is that postpartum women should not be in church. You should never see your uncle naked. If you curse your parents, right, you should receive the death penalty. And same with adultery. And also slavery is morally okay, right? So these are some of the variety of moral claims made in the Bible. So if you disagree with any of those, um, then it's not clear why you should agree with the claims that it makes regarding homosexuality, right? Um, so again, point being, if you if your reason, right, if you want to use as a premise in your argument against homosexuality the Bible, you should still be prepared to be logically consistent, right? And if you're going to follow that one claim that the Bible makes, you should follow the rest as well. And I think very few people are willing to do that, right? Willing to put their child to death if they ever, right, say, damn it, mom. Okay, and finally, Mike Pence's sort of implicit argument against homosexuality was that it would destroy our society by undermining traditional family life, right? So again, he is trying to offer a reason, implicitly treating this as a factual claim, right? Uh, and the question is it a true claim? Well, empirically, it does seem that so that certainly the gay lifestyle is not incompatible with raising children, right? Traditional family. Um, we'd see them more and more. I mean, even in 2017, when Pence was saying this, it was rather common, right, for homosexual couples to have children. Um, and it doesn't seem like they're any worse at raising children than heterosexual couples, right? Children of gay parents seem to have life outcomes at least as good as children of heterosexual parents. In some cases, better. And the text gives you a list of statistics support this. I remember one, and it's not in the text, but I just remember reading it a few years ago. I remember it because it was so like uh, stark and clear, which was that it was a survey of sort of rates of child abuse, and in that particular study, in the sample they used, they didn't find a single case of child abuse in households with lesbian parents, right? Um, which is plausible if you think men may be the larger source of violence in homes, right? Two mothers, right? Then it could potentially make sense that there was abuse, right? So I mean, interesting. And anyways, the point is that on all these, right? So we've just as an example, right, of moral reasoning as an objective endeavor, right? Um, we explored these arguments against homosexuality, and we saw they do offer reasons. And then, what we do in this course is we then analyze those reasons, and we didn't find any of those reasons, right, against homosexuality to be particularly, right? Maybe there's more out there, but at any rate, this was a bit of practice, right, in showing in engaging in moral reasoning, morality as an objective endeavor. So again, as I said, this course is a bit biased against subjectivism. Right? But hey, if you think any of these arguments, and it doesn't have to be about homosexuality, if you don't, if you feel that's a subject that you don't want to like focus on or don't feel comfortable focusing on, that's fine. That was just the example, right, for this chapter. But if you want to use another one and argue, no, actually subjectivism is true in your paper, that's fine. That could be interesting. Okay, so that's enough. 39 minutes. We're getting shorter and shorter. I really don't want to sort of like make these so long that you can't, I don't know, human brain can only pay attention for so long. So thanks for sticking with this, and I'll see you next week.